You are listening to Amplify Your Success Podcast, episode 194. And today we're going behind the scenes of a successful real estate coaching business and how podcasting accidentally accelerated this business's growth. Listen in, there's some real gems in today's episode. You ready for this? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Amplify Your Success Podcast. Hey, are you a thought leader, creative entrepreneur, or change maker and want to magnify your impact, boost influence while creating a financial abundance? Stay tuned for today's inspiring episode with your host, Melanie Benson.
Hello there, inspired entrepreneurs and business leaders. I'm excited to bring you today's guest. A little backstory. This is someone who I guested on his podcast probably close to 7 years ago. And it was so awesome to have the tables turned and me be able to put the spotlight on what podcasting has done for his business. This episode could really inspire you, especially if you've been putting off starting your own podcast. Now, if you do host your own podcast, one of the best ways to get more people listening to your podcast is to guest on other people's podcasts. It's a really valuable strategy, and it will help really boost your own authority, your own credibility, and pull people in who are looking for podcasts just like yours. They're a great audience because you know they already like podcasting. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure you have a really magnetic message. I've noticed that people who don't necessarily have a magnetic message are guesting but aren't getting great results. So whether you're wanting to inspire people to listen to your podcast or you're trying to grow your list, get more people into one of your programs, or you want to pick up some private clients, you've got a service business, whatever that is, podcast guesting is a fantastic way to build up that audience, but only if you know how to really structure your message so that it's inspiring and it acts like a magnet to pull people in. I've opened the doors to my Get Magnetic Messaging fall program. And if you struggle with your message, you feel maybe a lack of confidence to get yourself out there because you don't know how to really get all the nuggets in without overwhelming your audience, this is the perfect program for you. And you might want to take a peek over at Get Magnetic Messaging to some of the shares and testimonials of people that have gone through this program with me and how they found this instant confidence just by following this simple system. This program is not open year-round, and we have very limited seats because I work very deeply with the people in this program. If you think you want help getting your message magnetized so that not just attracting ideal clients, not just helping you build your list, not just positioning your authority, but also setting up that buzz quality that opens the door to really awesome opportunities, you're going to want to head over now to getmagneticmessaging.com, see if the program's right for you, and get enrolled before we sell out. Now, let me introduce you to today's guest. I can't wait to introduce you to J Massey. Now, he's the CEO and founder of Cashflow Diary, a training and development brand for building short-term rental entrepreneurs. Now, before Cashflow Diary, Jay raised capital and invested in traditional real estate, single-family homes, note brokering and holding, cell phone towers, things like that. And Jay built a community of thousands of like-minded people from 16 countries that he learns from every day and shares his knowledge through his Cashflow Diary podcast, YouTube channel, Facebook groups, and annual short-term rental summit training events. And he's also developed a coaching program around these principles. And I'm super excited to welcome you, Jay, to the Amplify Your Success podcast. And as we were in the green room, I was connecting some dots where I was on your podcast 6 years ago. Is that
Yeah.
8? Yeah.
Yeah. A long time. Well, it feels like a long time ago anyway.
In podcasting years, it is a long term. I think it's
Well,
like
that's
dog
true.
years.
Might be
Podcasting years are like
centuries
dog
at that
years.
case.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Well, welcome to the other side of the mic. I'm excited to learn more about what you've been up to and talk about how you have leveraged your podcast to grow a real estate coaching business, because real estate is just such a hot industry right now. I'm super curious. How did you get into this niche?
Yeah, totally. Into the real estate piece or specifically the
Real estate
podcast?
coaching.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about the real
Well,
estate coaching, because a lot of people do real estate, and yes, that is a really cool
sure.
niche, but now you've really specializing in coaching people on it.
Yeah, yeah. No, totally understood. Totally understood. So, what happened? Well, again, it wasn't even planned, I guess is the best way of saying it. And it was partly a solution to drive efficiency and convenience for me. Here's what I mean by that is I would go to a networking event, and while I'm there, individuals would ask me like, how did you build all this? How did you do what you do?" And then I, tell them because I was there, whatever. They ask a question, I'd answer it. And then what started to happen is that I started getting the same question repeatedly and over again. And then I got frustrated with answering literally the same question every time. So my genius, I said, I'll write it down. And that's why I wrote the book. But the book wasn't enough. People wanted more. And that's basically what happened is like, okay, great. Well, you keep asking the questions, I'll keep answering them, and then that'll begin the content piece of whatever I needed to do because I was answering the same questions from investors over and over again. And it was easier to point them to a video, point them to a podcast episode so that they could understand how we thought, how we viewed the world, how cash flow was created, etc. And then start from there. And that was the beginning is like, okay, well, at least I won't have to answer the same question again. And now I can make the conversations move along faster by pointing people to a resource that they could read and consume on their own time.
Yeah, and starting with a book is brilliant. As a matter of fact, I believe when I was on your podcast, you sent me a copy of that book, which is a really fantastic book. And then you later introduced your podcast. And I get asked all the time, and maybe you do too, should I start a podcast? When should I
Yes.
start a podcast? How is a
Now.
podcast going to help me? Yes. So
Oh.
now, and
Yeah.
what was the catalyst for you to start the podcast? And I'm really curious,
Got
like
it.
what you've seen happen to your business after starting it.
The catalyst was, well, a friend of mine, one of my business mentors, passed away in a plane crash, and he was 40 at the time. And I was not yet 40, but he was. And I was thinking, all right, what do we do? What happens if, so if that had been me, what would happen? So I kind of future paced, figure out, okay, what would happen? And I just came down to, yeah, the kids would get, a whole bunch of real estate eventually, right? And I'm like, well, is that it? Is that all? Is that all that I have to give? Is that truly the most valuable thing I possess? And I settled on the answer that no, it wasn't. And what was more valuable than how much ever real estate was how to operate, how to think, how to navigate the world, create value, turn that value into cash flow, all of those things. How to do that was way more valuable than any just giving a piece of real estate. So it started as I was going to document. That's it. All I was going to do, it was supposed to be documentation process for the kids. And so I set out writing a diary because that's what I thought, I was supposed to do, or at least that seemed like the logical thing. But I discovered writing was not my thing. It was not my method or mode of communication. And then a friend of mine had started a podcast. We were sharing our office at the time, and he suggested that I start a podcast. And I didn't. Again, I asked the same questions: Why difference does it make? I don't really care. And he's like, and he told me a whole bunch of things, but I just dismissed it because it didn't matter. I was doing this for my kids. But then I started recording episodes for my kids because I was like, cool, this is easier. I can do this, and then they can hear my voice. This is great. And then one day he finds out that I'm recording this for my kids, and he just simply says, you know, I bet adults would be interested in that information too. And I'm like, really? Okay. I mean, I guess, I don't know. But then I realized that if adults were interested, and more importantly, if adults actually duplicated results, even a percentage of the results, a fraction of it, I would then be able to use that as confirmation that I captured what I needed to capture so that my kids could duplicate if that's what it came to. So it just continued. I continued sharing, knowing that if an adult could do it, my kids would eventually be able to do it. And watching that process happen serves, like I said, as the confirmation to know that I have left behind all the instructions necessary to build whatever they want to build.
Mm. That's such a sweet and beautiful reason to start a podcast, and one I have absolutely never heard before. That is fantastic. Okay, so, knowing that you started it with such a heart-based reason and, family first, how have
Mhm.
you noticed it's impacted your coaching business?
Well, okay, so here's the funny, ironic part. There was never, with especially with the podcast, there was never any like intentional let me go make money with this thing. That was not even, I didn't even know that that was a piece of the thing. That actually happened and materialized again as a result of getting a lot of emails and messages. Hey, do you do a webinar? Hey, do you have a this? And in fact, it might have been a full on year, maybe even year and a half before of just producing episodes before we did any of that, with any intent. So it was mostly to serve the people. That's what happened, is that there was a demand for more information and they wanted an easy way to get it. So we just responded and developed. I think it was an ebook was the very first thing, because we would get these emails. Hey, can I just have a quick phone call with you? And because of the way podcasts are distributed, there's no way I could have a quote unquote quick phone call with everybody who wanted a quick phone call. It's just logistically not possible. So what ended up happening is one person got a phone call. I recorded that phone call, reduced that phone call to an ebook, and then that became the basis of the beginning of us providing content for people so that they could have an understanding of what it is that they needed to do in order to begin or fast track or make it go faster so that they could start to generate their results.
I heard two things in what you just said, and it really
Hmm.
lines up with what I believe and what I've seen from podcasting.
Mm.
First of all, service first. Like, how do
Hmm.
I share this message in a way that's consumable by more
Hmm.
people?
Yes.
Really, that service mentality. But then the second piece, and I don't know if you even intentionally meant this, but
Mm.
I believe that the podcasting side of things creates exposure that brings more paying opportunities.
Yes.
And
I
I've
know that
seen,
now.
yes, like that's the results from all your
Yeah,
hard
I
work,
know
right?
that now. I had no
Yeah,
clue at the time. That wasn't the genesis of the motivation. And that's not to say if that's your motivation that it's wrong or somehow like dirty or something. No, by all means, you're
it's
providing
the
value. It's
it's
what
the
I know
accidental
today.
outcome.
Yeah, it was just not the thing that said this is something that I could do. In fact, I didn't. It was so I was nervous to interview people because I didn't think anyone I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't think anyone would listen, let alone would I ask good questions? Do people care? I mean, anyway, there was just so many things that you don't know that you don't know. And again, I was doing it to make sure I got the lessons for my kids. I wasn't
Right.
thinking, oh, the audience is going to love this. That was never the case. In fact, every time I said to myself, oh man, that episode was horrible, and we published it anyway, we often got the, "Oh, that was the greatest thing ever." I'm like, "Really?" And I was like, "Okay, great. I don't know anything, so I'm just gonna keep publishing and keep moving."
I've had that same thing happen where I'm like, "Ugh, this is gonna be a dud," and it turns
Mhm.
out to be a fan favorite. I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah,
So I'm
whatever.
willing to be surprised. But,
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the interviewing guest part. I
Mhm.
think that's another thing that gets people a little conflicted sometimes, and
Mm.
they get in their head about it.
Mhm.
What would you say to someone who's evaluating whether or not to just do solo episodes or do interviews? Have you I don't know if you've noticed a great difference one way or the other and the impact you have.
Um, I'd say do both actually. There are times where I think every audience wants to hear from you because that's ultimately who they have the relationship with. And they also enjoy hearing you interact with other people. I think that it's a combination of many different things. The more sides of you that you can and are willing to share, I think the more they like it. That's at least where I come from that standpoint. So I don't think it's a either or conversation. It's more of a both. And the harder conversation, in my opinion, is, do I have a co-host or not? That's a harder
Mm.
one, because there's a certain level of consistency and commitment required, and from both of you at that point. And it's like, whew, that could be a thing, right? Do episodes work when the co-host or the main host aren't there? Now I don't know, and that I think that's the more difficult decision.
And what was your process for deciding
I've
that for
never had a
yourself?
co-host. I just
Oh,
I
okay.
just didn't I
I
just
had
didn't
one
even
once.
I said, "Nope, I'm not gonna go there. It'll be me because I'll just keep going." But it's not that I'm not open to it. I think it would be good. But the level of commitment required from both parties simultaneously up front is huge. And you just got to make sure that, because I'm not perfect and I've dropped the ball on people and vice versa. And I don't expect I expect other people to not be perfect as well. But, so that's just one of those things that you have to work out. And that's one of those things that you can choose to not deal with at all.
I think for me,
Yes.
I'm too much of a control freak. I'll just own it. Like,
Oh,
I
I
know
I
what
get
I want
that.
to do.
I
I
get
know how
that.
I want it to roll. I know what we can produce. I often um, I think a co-host sometimes creates a level of unpredictability that I just haven't been willing to dance with lately. So
Yeah,
I
no, I
think you have
get
to
that.
really consider that, right? Like, how much do you need that dynamic of someone else involved to feel good about the produced outcome,
Mhm.
and how much can you produce on your own? So I'm glad you brought that
And
up.
more
That's a really
importantly,
interesting.
what does the audience resonate with? Because there
Yes.
will be a portion of the audience that the reason that they want to listen to the episodes is because of the interaction between the
Hmm.
hosts. Like if you think about what is it, the Breakfast Club. When you're here listening to Charlemagne, yeah, they have guests, they interview people, but when you hear Charlemagne interacting with all of the other members, that's part of that their ongoing relationship becomes its own character, if you will, inside the show. And that could very well be or become part of the reason why some people continue to listen. And sometimes that's the thing. And then you have to ask yourself, does that create, like, single points of failure? And what happens when that person doesn't want to uh, do it anymore? I don't know, but something happens. That's what I know. I mean, these are the things that you just got to think about, because if because again, I'm pretty positive that if for some people could be Angela Yee. If she decides to no longer be there, that could be the reason they no longer listen to the Breakfast Club, or DJ Envy for that matter. It just really doesn't matter. But it's all three of them that really create the Breakfast Club. And then yeah, they interview people too.
Okay, now you're dropping all of these names, and I'm like, who is that? Now I have to go listen
there
and see what it is he's talking about.
it's a talk show, and it's one of your more traditional morning talk shows, but they're on like iHeartRadio, and especially since this whole COVID thing, they've been doing and producing content in a more non-traditional format. But it's all three of them creating an episode, and they could interview whomever, because they have the ability and the reach to get a number of different individuals. But it's because of the way the three of them work together. For some people, that's why they listen, because they want all of their perspectives. And there are many times where they will start talking to each other, even though there's another person, even though there's someone that they're interviewing there, because their internal relationship with each other also becomes a character part of the show.
Sounds cool. I'm going to check it out now.
It's just another thing to consider. It's not, there's not saying it's good, it's not saying it's bad, but when you switch into producing content, understand that you're creating value. Like right now, where I'm just now going through the process of even monetizing the content. We've been producing for 7 years and don't do, we're just now thinking, okay, let's go ahead and get advertising and sponsors, and let's intentionally do, affiliate marketing, all of that stuff that people like to talk about. Heretofore, all it has been is the thing that feeds and us more students is ultimately what ends up happening, or speaking engagements for myself. That's pretty much what ends up happening.
Well, let's flip over to talking about your coaching business.
Sure.
Coaching is such a huge industry, and you're
Very.
coaching people on how to do the different types of real estate investing that you teach. What do you think is the most important and the most effective way that you attract ideal clients into your coaching business?
Hmm. I would say that part of what happens, I would have to assume, because I hear this a lot, part of what happens is there comes the question, or they get to a point where they ask themselves a question of, okay, I've learned a lot for free. How much more could I possibly learn? Is there really that much more? Like, if I paid, what would happen? Could I actually do? And the answer is yes. But I think that's what ends up happening, is that there's a significant amount of perceived and honestly real value inside the free content that allows people to make, enough smaller wins that gets them going, okay, I think I'm really, really ready to do this thing. And the other thing that I hear a lot is, appreciate, the words they use is, I appreciate your teaching style. And I'm like, okay, tell me more about what you mean. There's like, well, there's something in the way that you talk and teach told me that you were actually doing it. You're not just teaching about it from like yesterday, or years ago, but this was something that was active and real for you. I was like, oh, cool. Well, great. And again, that wasn't something that was manufactured. It's something I do. I teach what I do, right? Because that's just what it is. And there are some individuals who hear that because they are comparing us to the other practitioners that are out there, or the other instructors, or people that are out there, and they'll tell us, hey, I was listening to this person, and this person over here, and this, that, and the other, and they're just the way you answered questions and how you did what you did, it was clear to me that you know what you're doing. It's like, oh, cool, well, thanks for choosing us.
Resonance.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really about resonance in so many ways, because there are multiple people who usually have similar offerings to another coach. But I think people are looking for that resonance. Like, who do I trust? Who do I feel
Right.
I could learn from, and I'm going to get massive value?
Right. Now, and honestly, it doesn't hurt to have like a sickening amount of audio, video, and written testimonials from people that come from all walks of life, because we 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 have a lot.
That just shows you're credible, right?
Yeah, so that doesn't hurt either. But yes.
Right. Right. And I think that if you want to use this old cliche of the know, like, and trust factor,
Hmm.
when you get that third party endorsement, it really
Hmm.
does up that know, like, and trust factor, or at least the trust factor, when you
Hmm.
don't have
Hmm.
a personal connection with somebody.
Right. And which is again another benefit, I believe, that anyone who produces a podcast eventually you get, because you get to a point to where you have, I don't know, hundreds of episodes. And what happens is, someone on their own time, maybe they had a holiday weekend, maybe they, were doing a road trip or whatever. They have a stretch of time, a number of hours in a lot of cases, and they just decide, you know what? I'm just going to listen to this podcast. I'm going to listen and find out what this is all about. And they end up binge listening to, 5, 10, 20 episodes. And then they feel like they have a relationship with you by the time they're done with that. They feel like they know you, and to agree, they do, because they know they know way more about you than you them. And because I've had some very interesting interactions with listeners out in the world when uh, you know simply because you can be going through life, and in my case, it typically happens either at Starbucks or the movie theater. That's the two most common places where I run into a listener, and it's really ironic, I guess, is the best way of saying it, but
Mm,
it happens all the time.
that's so interesting. It is always kind of funny when you run into somebody and they go, "I've been listening to your show. How cool is that?"
At first, it freaked me out, but because I was like, "Wait, what?" Because I remember when we got our first 100 downloads, I was, and I this is somewhat embarrassing to say, but we had 100 total downloads, and I was actually going to Starbucks, nervous that I was going to run into somebody who had listened to it. Because again, I wasn't very confident behind the production of it or any of those things. And I was nervous. I actually literally thought that from 100 downloads, the odds of running into someone at a random Starbucks that I was going to would happen. I think it's hilarious.
So this is such an interesting perspective. I deal with so many people, and I know that we have so
Mhm.
many listeners who have this sense of hesitancy, or maybe it's imposter syndrome, where they're like, does anybody really want to hear from me? Or they don't really feel like they've got it all together yet. But you started anyway, even though you weren't sure that what you were
Yeah.
doing would matter or have value to other people. Looking back on that journey, right?
Yes.
Looking back
Yes.
now, knowing how many people you've impacted, how much this podcast has grown your business, how much writing that book not just impacted your own business, but impacted the lives of so many other people who
Hmm.
follow your trainings.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who's holding themselves back out of fear that they may not have it all together yet?
That fear is normal. That's fine, but fear is not the reason you don't move forward. If you go listen, if you can find and go listen to my very first episode, I literally say that I'm afraid this is for my kids, and I don't even know if people are going to listen because I don't know what to do. Anyway, that's not the reason to move forward. I mean, I get being afraid, and ultimately, here's the process. All of us are on a journey to becoming a different version than ourselves. So the version of you that is here, that is present right now, that is feeling that fear, has learned to respond to fear and interpret it as stop. I'm afraid. Stop. And thus far, that's exactly what you've done. However, your desire to produce the content, part of the reason that you yearn to do so is because there's a bigger version, a 2.0, 3.0 version of you that is begging to come out. Yeah, I mean, you're listening right now because you're looking for the excuse, the reason to go, yes, that's why I can finally go all in. And unfortunately, I don't have that answer for you other than to say, the new version of you, uh, will be different than the existing version of you. And the new version of you will learn to interpret that same emotional signal, which does not go away. So you will still feel afraid, but you'll learn to interpret that signal with a different action. You'll have a different association to it because before now, the world taught you, hey, you raise your hand, you think you're right. If you get it wrong, the entire class laughs at you. And you're like, I ain't doing that again. Right. And this is the equivalent or the 2020 equivalent of doing the exact same thing. You are raising your hand and sharing your opinion. And there will be people who do not agree. And that's still okay. It is completely okay because you still should do it anyway. Because there are so many people who do agree. And the only way they're going to find you, receive the help, the value of your insight is if you display the courage, which is not the absence of fear. It is being afraid, literally being in the state of fear and still moving towards the goal. That's what must be developed. And you have the capacity to develop it. Otherwise, you would have never listened, not only to this podcast, but to this specific episode. In fact, you've already disconnected from this episode and you haven't heard it. So if you're still hearing my words, I'm talking to you. You are that person that courage is beckoning forward, and just take the biggest baby step you possibly can. Release it in the version that is already there. That people don't know. Your audience is literally waiting. And I think about this all the time. Somebody somewhere right now is praying for the answers to the questions that I've already been through. They want it, they need it, they're looking for it, and they haven't found it, or they haven't found it from the person that they are willing, or as you said earlier, resonate with. And that's the person I keep in mind every time I do an interview, every time I record a podcast, every time we make a video, every time we send out an email. I'm thinking about that person because, well, honestly, that was me. And because other individuals were brave enough to risk being criticized, ridiculed, laughed at by other people, because they were brave enough to risk that and kept doing it anyway. That's why that's how I learned to build and create cash flow. That's it. Had they chose not to, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know. Maybe I would have found someone else, but maybe not. And the same is true for each and every person who has it in their heart, mind, and spirit for creating content. There's, your 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people. They're literally waiting. And I don't even care what the subject is anymore, because the world is so unique that I don't care what it is. You don't even need that many people, first of all, but more importantly, there is enough people out there who like what you like, who think like you think, believe what you believe, that are willing to follow you.
That was very well said. I'm sitting there taking that in, thinking, yes, that's exactly what someone might need to hear today to take that bold leap forward. So
Yeah.
love that.
Mhm.
You touched on something. I just want to come back to it before we wrap up, because if you're thinking about using a podcast or leveraging podcasting to grow your own business, whatever industry you're in, this is always going to come up. There's a moment when you realize, I am putting so much time and energy into this podcast. Is it worth it? You said you've just started to monetize.
Yeah, we haven't done it
How,
yet. Like literally haven't done it, but we're good. That is like literally the next step.
what was the trigger to realize it's time to move to a little more finances in the game to make this podcast, maybe, I don't know if profitable is the right word, but monetize it, as you said?
Well, part of it is getting an understanding that there are more people we could serve if slash when I bring on more people to help me produce it, period, in a more consistent basis. So not just a company that we contract with that has the capacity to edit, but what if I brought in an employee who's literally their job description, double podcast listenership. That's your job, right? Well, the only reason more people don't do that is because supporting that is well, it's not free, nor should it be. So instead of having to take, say from a different part of the business, why not have it support itself? And then it's just another evolution. It's just another step that allows us to reach more people. Cause that's ultimately what happens is I'm like, well, cool, we got 2 million downloads. Yay. How can we get to 10 in like half the time? How can we get another 8 million downloads in half the time it took us to get to 2? And when you start asking that question, different things come up. Well, we need someone to do this piece and this piece and this piece and this piece. And then it's like, okay, well, how do you fund that? How do you manage that? Whose job is that? And you start creating things because when you hear people that you have never met that fly across the world uh, to come and meet you and make effort to track you down because they heard your podcast and it helped them to create an orphanage. It helped them to decide that, you know what, I can choose to no longer stay in this job that I don't like. There is an option for me that fits. You know what? I'm 65, but it's not too late. Here's something I can do. Wh- When you hear that from enough people, uh, I can internalize that going, I'm failing, a significant number of people because they just don't know. They don't know we exist yet. Not because we don't exist, but because the brand isn't where it needs to be. I mean, we're dealing with, and at least depending on what country you're in when you're listening to this, um, we're dealing with 40 million people who are unemployed right now. 40 million. I know a very strong percentage of that 40 million are looking for an answer. I also know a similarly strong percentage of that 40 million do not know of the Cashflow Diary podcast. I know that because we didn't get 40 million downloads this month, right? So my job then becomes, if we can help, since we have proven our ability to help, is to go and help more people, to save more families and fathers and mothers from having to make what ultimately becomes a detrimental decision to the family. They don't want, they don't really want to, quote unquote, go to work. Everybody wants to provide value. You don't really want to go to work per se. And if you could do so in a different way, but if you could do so with more time, if you could do so with all of these other things in place, you would gladly choose. If you could stay at home, attend every one of your kids' games, and heaven forbid, should your kid be good at a sport, they're good. Now they might have special training on all this other stuff. Your kid could be an Olympic gold medal athlete, and you know it, but you're like, man, I just don't have the resources to support them. But if you did, and it didn't, quote unquote, cost you revenue in your business or income, and if it didn't feel, just overly burdensome in that way, you probably do it because you love your kid, right? You wouldn't, if you knew that something happened in your family, regardless of the type of emergency, that you wouldn't be thinking about, oh man, I don't have any more vacation days. I don't know if I can take any more time off to deal with this. You know, that is a better lifestyle, at least in my opinion. And it's something that we've been able to provide for people now. And I choose to believe, I guess I should say, that there's a lot of people who would want that. And part of the reason that they haven't gotten it yet isn't because the information isn't out there. It's because they don't know we produce the information. And very specifically, as I said, they they don't currently resonate with the people that they do know produce the information. So our specific content, your specific content on your thing is specifically needed. You're the only one that can reach certain people. And you may not see it that way yet, but it's very, very true.
Hmm. Well, there's no better reason to grow your exposure for your podcast and to bring this work around the cash flow programs that you have. And I know you've probably got a resource that you could share with our listeners, because I got to believe we got several listeners whose career path has radically shifted over the last couple of months. And
Right.
there's always a great opportunity to diversify your revenue
Right.
base through real estate. So where's the next step people could find you?
So if you type in Cashflow Diary, just like it sounds, Cashflow Diary, in anywhere, you'll find us. That's very, very simple. However, one of the things that I like to tell people is, while yes, we do have a podcast at cashflowdiarypodcast.com, one of the best ways to start a journey is to have a goal. And oftentimes the common question I get is like, how many units or how long is it going to take me before I can retire, or this, that, and the other? I was like, okay, cool. So I don't really care the amount of income that you are wanting to replace or earn or what have you, but whatever it is, you need to know what that goal looks like tangibly. So most people don't know how to calculate it. So what we did is we made a calculator for you. Meaning, if you say to me, hey, Jay, I have $250,000 a year. That's what I earn. How long would it take me to replace? How many short-term rental units do I need in order to replace my income? Well, we made you a calculator that would do exactly that and tell you. So you can go to cashflowdiary.com/how many units. and you put it in your information, name, email, blah, blah, blah. It's all the stuff. Tell us when do you want this money by? A whole bunch of questions. And then at the end, on the other side, what ends up happening is it says, hey, for you, this is what you would need to do. This is, how many units you would need, whether you want a single family house, apartments, what have you. And you'd end up knowing, okay, well, cool. I only need 10 units. You're telling me I can retire? Yeah. And for some of you, it'll be 30. And some of you, it'll be much less than that. It doesn't really matter, but now you know. And you can begin to chase something that's a little bit more tangible than just one day, I hope I can, earn enough income so that I can actually, quote unquote, retire or do whatever it is that you want to do. So just go over to cashflowdiary.com/how many units.
Nice. I like it. I will make sure that link is also in the show notes for you so that you have it handy. And it sounds like a really interesting financial exploration to see, can you meet your goals and what would have to be different to meet these revenue goals. So, Jay, before we wrap up, I always like to ask my guests the question, taking a step back, looking in your journey from where you started, where you are now, what do you think was the boldest step you took to get you where you are today?
Well, when you put it that way, that's different. Okay, so the boldest step, I mean, is in my opinion, it is the risk that we talked about earlier. It's literally getting started. It's literally raising your hand. It's producing content to putting yourself in a vulnerable enough a position to be ridiculed in some way, shape, or form, because that's not exactly something that a lot of us want to deal with. We're okay if it goes well and everybody's like, "Yay, you did it!" But if it doesn't, how do you handle that? And there have been many instances, but there have been times where we had a situation in which a transaction did not go well. A gentleman was able to embezzle over $800,000, and we still kept going. We still keep going. I mean, that's now been years ago, and but you still keep going, and that can feel internally like, oh my God, it's over. But yet you keep going, right? So there will be lots of resistance. The system is not necessarily designed to make it easy for you, and you'll encounter them. But if you are resolute, or when you develop that perseverance, you push through. That takes a certain level of boldness to say things like what I just said. Hey, I have been in a situation where $800,000 went away from me, gone. Not a lot of people are willing to admit that. And similarly, a couple years ago, I was diagnosed uh, autistic and ADHD. I didn't know this, but learning to deal with things that are perceived popularly as a weakness, or oh my God, I can't believe you told people, um all of those things, they lose their power when you're willing to admit them. But they also give your would-be customer, your audience, permission to take a risk, to be themselves without thinking they have to be a certain way in order to succeed. And if your goal is to help other people in that way, then be bold. Don't just say the good stuff. Say the bad stuff too, whatever that might be. And I think you'll find that on the other end, people will be very, very grateful for it.
That was really extraordinary. And I'm leaving this conversation with a whole new appreciation for the word bold. And what I just took from what you said is recognize that oftentimes it is bold to just show up and share what you do in the world. And if that's where you are, Jay has been an extraordinary inspiration for us today to recognize we just have to show up and keep moving forward. So Jay, thanks so much for joining me on my podcast this time and sharing your brilliance, sharing your journey. I want to invite and encourage you to go get Jay's really great resource. The calculator he talked about is at cashflowdiary.com/how many units. I will load that up in the show notes for you. And check out the podcast, Cashflow Diary. It's so good. You might not think you want to do real estate yet, or maybe you do, but you never know when you're going to get inspired or be able to share this with somebody who's really looking for a great revenue game to shift up this year. So Jay, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for being brave enough to produce content.
It's in my soul. I can't not do it. All right. See you all next week on another edition of Amplify Your Success Podcast. This is Melanie Benson, your host. Thanks so much for listening in today. If you want to catch up on any of the show notes and circle back on any of the resources we shared in today's show, head on over to the show page at amplifyyoursuccesspodcast.com. And remember, you amplify your results faster when you're in a community of other people who are moving and shaking. Join us at amplifyyoursuccesscommunity.com. One last thing. When you've gained insight from today's episode, help us share that and inspire other people by heading over to iTunes, subscribing, and give it a review. iTunes absolutely loves seeing these reviews pop up, and it actually helps boost my show's visibility. So I would be super grateful for your reviews. And as always, I love seeing your shares of these episodes on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Come find me over there. Tag me in your shares. I'll give you some social media love right back. So see you next week for another inspiring episode of Amplify Your Success Podcast.